In your presentation, you spoke to us about how the two greatest challenges to the world, the first one was the world's biggest environmental problem was air pollution, and then another problem was poverty. But how does that sit, though, when you have an organisation like the IPCC that says it's unequivocal about the dangers of and the seriousness of climate change, and that globally there needs to be sustained reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, or we're facing potentially permanent changes? How does that sit that that is not the most important environmental issue as opposed to air pollution?
Well, I mean, the simple answer is we want everything, right? We want to make sure nobody dies from diseases. We want everybody educated, nobody hungry. We want everybody not to have indoor air pollution or outdoor air pollution. We don't want climate change. We don't want anything that's bad. I agree with that, and the IPCC has been asked to talk about what do we want on climate. And of course they say we shouldn't have this extra emissions of CO2. But in the real world, we don't have the luxury of just saying we want everything. And so we've got to ask ourselves, what do we want first and what do we want most? Now, this is not a comfortable conversation, but remember, we have to make it, because if we don't, we just simply end up picking stuff that maybe looks good on TV or makes us feel good, but don't actually do the most good for the world.
But John Connor, do you agree with that argument then, that in a sense air pollution is a bigger problem than climate change?
No, because I think we've got a finite physical system. This is actually a physical issue about the extent of carbon pollution we're putting in our atmosphere. Once we start to, we're already in dangerous climate change. There's already dangerous impacts happening, and avoiding the dangerous levels of warming is a very important task, and that's one that's very urgently desired also by development agencies and others who realise all of their work in achieving some of the goals that Mr. Lomborg talks about are being unravelled, like AIDS did to much of their work as well. So it's, in our view, a phony choice. It's false economics to be picking a couple of these priorities when we're dealing with a finite planet and the climate.
Now, you don't have to wait for me to interrupt.
All right, great. So fundamentally, I mean, there's two arguments to this. One is, it's just simply wrong. I mean, I just showed you the graphs, and these are basic data that indicates that right now about 141,000 people die from global warming, and about 4.3 million people, so about 30 times more, die from indoor air pollution. That's just not of course we can have a conversation, is it 250,000, is it mismatched in this or the other way, but it's just very obvious in that very basic point that I showed up there. But there's another way that it's even more true, and that's where let me just do my 2 points here. The second one is, of course, to talk about how much can we do about this. And the simple answer is, you know, if you look, for instance, and this is one of the things that frustrates me endlessly, the Swedish development minister actually just announced that they were going to spend about $500 million Australian dollars on cutting carbon emissions in third world countries. That will, with reasonable estimates, postpone global warming by the end of the century by 20 minutes. If you, on the other hand, had spent that in the best possible way, you could have helped about 500,000 people not die. And so the reality here is to say, sure, the poor will have more problems with more global warming. That's absolutely true. But what we can do to help them through global warming policies is incredibly little compared to some of the other policies that we can choose. Sorry.
So thank you. Well, on those two fronts, I mean, the point I was trying to make, that was bad out the back, but we've got to stop cherry picking the costs. The problem, the source of both of those problems is from our energy systems, of the deaths from warming and indoor air pollution, you said. As I said, the deaths from outdoor air pollution are roughly the same as indoor air pollution, mostly coming from fossil fuels. And so these are a very important question right now in terms of the priority. It's actually false to sort of pick and choose the exact slices of costs or deaths or other indicators that you want to use when we're talking about those sorts of impacts. And so the co-benefits, and this is a very important point because world leaders and others are beginning to realise that there's actually multiple benefits from taking actions in transforming energy system, reducing pollution. That's why, I mean, I'm not saying China is waging its war on pollution mostly because of climate change. It's doing it because of the threats of those unrest, the absolute physical and threats, dangers and loss of life and mortality, which is up to 10% in most recent data. But it's combined. These are combined initiatives, and they cascade together in what we do. So it's actually an important way in which we can multiply the benefits of action.
I mean, there was a group called the Australian Youth Climate Coalition this week argued that the rapid expansion of the fossil fuel industry will actually cost those living under the poverty line their health and their clean air, and that poverty is linked to the environment, and that the poor are actually the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change.
Yes, there's a couple of things we need to separate here. There is no doubt, and we agree on this, that the poor will suffer more from global warming, mostly because they live where global warming impacts are going to be hardest, and because they have little infrastructure, they have little wealth to deal with the problems that will be caused by global warming. But what we have to remember is also that the poor stands to gain most from actually getting into, for instance, the global economy, getting out of poverty, not being diminished in a place where they die from indoor air pollution and all these other things. And so it's really a question of the size of the issue here. And one of the problems I have with the conversation, and again, this is a little bit, a direct question to you, but you say that this is mostly about getting people on green energy. But it's very, very clear if you look at the IEA's predictions, for instance, for sub-Saharan Africa, and that is really the lowest of the low in the world. They have the least access, they have the least energy, and they predict almost all of the increase in energy is going to come from not green energy. It's going to come from fossil fuels. And that's why I want to,
Which scenario? When the IEA
yes.
is a very impressive organisation. It does a range of scenarios.
Yes.
And I'm not sure which one of that
this
one is.
This is the new policy. This is the optimistic, the green optimistic scenario.
No, it's not. The new policies one, you just said that it is,
yes.
is actually their estimation of the current policies which have been made some commitments to it. The IEA does other scenarios for when we take action to avoid 2 degrees, their 450 scenarios.
Yes.
They also have high renewable scenarios for Africa and others, which have much stronger push through in renewables in their mix. I mean, it's and many not in your industry, the energy industry, that use this trick. They quote the IEA, they quote this new policy scenario, they talk about their concern for climate change, but that is a world of 4 degrees warming. That's a world of runaway, cascading impacts, particularly and let me just finish, particularly with the big impacts, which we've just agreed, the big impacts are on the poor the most from those sorts of impacts.
Yes.